The morning sun lit up the front steps of the county courthouse as people rushed inside. Lawyers, reporters, and families came through the large double doors, each with their own purpose. Most didn't notice the teenager walking among them, holding a black briefcase and wearing a suit that seemed one size too big. His name was Jacob Tanner, and he looked like he didn't belong. But he walked with calm steps, his eyes steady, as if he had done this 100 times before. Inside courtroom 2 bits, the mood was serious, like always. The judge was already seated, flipping through files. Lawyers were setting up, adjusting their ties and organizing their papers. The audience seats began to fill up. It was supposed to be a simple hearing. Nothing special, just another routine day in court. Then Jacob walked in. Heads turned, a few people frowned, some whispered. The bailiff narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Jacob walked straight to the defense table and placed his briefcase on it. He opened it smoothly and began laying out his papers. It was quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes when people don't know what to say. A woman sitting behind the railing leaned toward the person next to her and whispered, "Is this some kind of joke? Is he someone's little brother?" The judge looked up and noticed Jacob. He stared for a moment, unsure whether to laugh or ask questions. "Young man," the judge said in a slow voice, "are you sure you're in the right place?" Jacob looked up, calm and polite. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm here for the defense." A short silence followed, then a few quiet laughs from the audience. Someone at the back chuckled, thinking it must be a prank. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Even the clerk looked confused. Jacob didn't react. He simply returned to his papers, flipping through them like any other lawyer would. He took out a pen and began making notes. The judge tried again. "Are you telling me you're representing the defendant?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jacob replied, not even looking nervous. The judge leaned back in his chair. "This should be interesting," he muttered under his breath. People around the room were still staring, waiting for someone to stop Jacob, to tell him he couldn't be there. But no one moved. He stood there so confidently, it was hard to know what to do next. Outside the courtroom, the world carried on like normal. Cars passed by. Birds chirped in the trees. But inside courtroom 2 bits, something unusual was unfolding. And everyone who was there had the same question in mind. Who was this teenager? And what in the world was he doing in a courtroom? No one knew yet, but they were about to find out. Judge Hollins was known around the courthouse for his sharp tongue and serious face. He had been on the bench for over 20 years and didn't like surprises. He looked at the young man standing confidently at the defense table and raised an eyebrow. "You lost, kid," the judge said, his voice dry and sarcastic. "Debate club is down the street. This is a real courtroom." Some people in the courtroom laughed. A few others shook their heads. They thought the boy would turn red or try to leave. But Jacob didn't flinch. He looked the judge in the eye and said calmly, "I understand, Your Honor, but I'm here for a real case." The judge's smile faded a little. "And you're telling me you're representing the defendant in this trial?" "Yes, sir," Jacob said. "I'm fully prepared." The judge stared at him for a moment, then looked at the bailiff. "Has anyone checked if this young man is even allowed to be here?" The bailiff shrugged. He didn't have an answer. Everything about Jacob seemed so strange, but at the same time, the boy didn't look scared or confused. He looked like he knew exactly what he was doing. The prosecutor, Mr. Collins, stood up. He was in his 40s, wore an expensive suit, and had won many cases in that very courtroom. He chuckled as he looked at Jacob. "Your Honor," he said with a smirk, "if this young man wants to waste the court's time pretending to be a lawyer, I won't stop him. But I don't think the jury will take him seriously." Jacob simply opened a folder on the desk and began reading through it. He didn't respond to the insult. Instead, he took out a pen and started writing notes. The calmness in his movements was strange. It made people pause. The judge cleared his throat. "All right," he said. "We'll proceed for now. But if this turns out to be some kind of joke, we're stopping immediately." "Understood." "Yes, Your Honor," Jacob said without looking up. The judge leaned back in his chair, still not fully convinced. He gave a glance to the audience, which had grown more curious. Even the court reporter seemed more alert than usual, her fingers ready on the keys. Jacob continued working as if he had done it 100 times. He marked parts of the case file, underlined sentences, and highlighted key points. The way he moved wasn't loud or flashy, but there was something about him that caught attention. It was like watching someone perform a task they were born to do. More people in the gallery leaned forward. They wanted to see what this unusual teenager would do next. The laughter was gone now. The courtroom wasn't sure what to expect anymore. The courtroom was filled with whispers. People couldn't stop talking about the boy at the defense table. Some leaned over to ask their neighbors questions. Others just stared, trying to figure out what was going on. Is he really going to argue a case? One man asked in a low voice. He must be someone's assistant. Another replied, maybe he's just sitting in. But Jacob wasn't just sitting. He had now arranged his papers neatly and was reading through a thick document. His focus didn't break, even with all the eyes watching him. It was clear he had no plans to leave or back down. The defendant, a middle-aged man named Mr. Langley, sat beside Jacob. He looked just as surprised as everyone else, but he didn't speak. It seemed he had been told in advance who would be defending him. He kept glancing at Jacob, unsure but hopeful. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins, the prosecutor, smiled confidently. He walked up to the front with a stack of papers and gave a short nod to the judge. "Ready when you are, Your Honor," he said. The judge looked back at Jacob. "Mr. Tanner," he said, trying out the name, "you still ready to go through with this?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jacob answered firmly. More whispers followed. Some people began recording the moment on their phones, careful to keep the cameras low. No one wanted to miss what might become a viral moment. The trial officially began. Mr. Collins gave his opening statement first. He spoke clearly, with strong words. He explained how the evidence would show that Mr. Langley was guilty. He pointed to facts and mentioned witness names. He looked comfortable and professional, just like everyone expected. When he finished, it was Jacob's turn. Jacob stood slowly, held his notes in one hand, and walked toward the jury. The courtroom fell silent again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today, I'm not asking you to believe something just because I say it. I'm asking you to listen carefully, think for yourselves, and look closely at the facts." His voice was calm but sure. He didn't speak too fast or too slow. He used simple words, but each one felt like it mattered. He walked the jury through what they would see, what they would hear, and why it mattered. As he spoke, something shifted in the room. People stopped whispering. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. There was something in Jacob's tone, something that made you want to listen. He didn't stumble. He didn't pause too long. He didn't sound nervous. He sounded ready. When Jacob finished his opening, he returned to his seat, organized his papers again, and looked straight ahead. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Then softly, someone whispered, "That didn't sound like a kid." They were right. It didn't. The first witness was called to the stand. It was a police officer who had responded to the scene the night Mr. Langley was arrested. The prosecutor asked his questions, and the officer answered confidently. Everything seemed to be going smoothly for the prosecution. When it was Jacob's turn to cross-examine, the room grew quiet again. Many people still didn't believe what they were seeing. But Jacob stood up without hesitation, holding a small notebook in one hand. He walked slowly toward the witness stand. "Officer," he began politely, "you said earlier that you arrived at the scene at 9:17 p.m., correct?" "Yes," the officer replied. "And you said you found Mr. Langley near the front door of the shop." "That's right." Jacob flipped a page in his notebook. "Can you please look at this copy of the shop's security camera footage?" He handed the officer a paper with a printed image showing a timestamp. The officer studied it. "Does it say 9:02 p.m.? Jacob asked. "Yes, it does." "And do you see Mr. Langley in that image?" The officer looked closer. "No, I don't." Jacob nodded. "So according to this, Mr. Langley wasn't even there at 9:02, and you arrived at 9:17. Are you saying he suddenly appeared in 15 minutes, committed a crime, and stayed near the door without running away?" The officer hesitated. "Well, it's possible." "Possible," Jacob repeated, "but not proven." The judge raised an eyebrow. The jury took notes. The people in the back rows of the courtroom leaned forward. Jacob had just made the first dent in the prosecution's story. He continued questioning the officer, pointing out small details, things most people wouldn't even notice, like how the lights in the video didn't match the time the officer said he saw them on, or how a bag of items wasn't visible in one photo but suddenly appeared in another. Each point made the case seem less certain. The officer, who had seemed so sure at first, now looked unsure and a little frustrated. When Jacob finished, he returned to his seat without saying a word. The courtroom stayed silent for a few seconds before the judge finally spoke. "You may step down," he told the officer. People in the courtroom looked at one another. They hadn't expected this, not from a teenager. Even Mr. Collins, the experienced prosecutor, was no longer smiling. He looked across the room at Jacob and narrowed his eyes. Jacob calmly took a sip of water and reviewed his notes for the next witness. Whatever people had thought about him before, they were starting to see something different now. This wasn't just a kid pretending to be a lawyer. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. By the time the second witness took the stand, the courtroom felt different. The judge sat straighter in his chair, the jury looked more alert, and the crowd in the back was no longer whispering jokes or doubts. Now they were paying close attention. Jacob had surprised everyone with how calm and smart he was. His questions weren't loud or dramatic, but they made people think. He didn't speak to impress. He spoke to find the truth. The new witness was a shopkeeper who claimed to have seen Mr. Langley near the store on the night of the incident. He said Mr. Langley looked nervous and acted strange. Mr. Collins, the prosecutor, smiled as the witness spoke. It sounded like clear proof against the defendant. But Jacob just listened quietly, his pen moving slowly over his notebook. When it was Jacob's turn to question the witness, he stood up, walked to the front, and looked the man in the eye. "Sir," Jacob began, "you said you saw Mr. Langley from across the street, correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "And it was dark outside at the time?" "Yes." Jacob nodded. "How far would you say the distance was between you and him?" "Maybe 30 or 40 feet. Jacob flipped to a page in his file. "Do you wear glasses?" The man blinked. "Yes, I do." "Were you wearing them that night?" The man paused. "No, I don't think so." Jacob turned toward the jury. "So, at night, from across the street, without your glasses on, you were still able to clearly recognize my client?" The witness shifted in his seat. "Well, I think it was him." Jacob stepped back. "You think it was him, but you're not certain?" "No, not completely," the man admitted. A few heads in the courtroom slowly nodded. Jacob had done it again. With a few simple questions, he had shown that the witness wasn't fully sure of what he saw. The strong testimony suddenly became weak. The judge leaned forward and scribbled something in his notes. Mr. Collins tapped his pen against the table, now looking more focused than before. Even the bailiff whispered quietly to the court clerk, "Who is this kid?" Jacob sat back down beside Mr. Langley, who gave him a small nod of thanks. Jacob just returned to his papers, not seeking praise. He acted like this was just another part of the job. Outside the courtroom, no one knew what was going on inside. But inside, something rare was happening. People were starting to believe in Jacob, not because of his age, but because of his skill. The courtroom had started the day thinking he was a joke. Now they weren't so sure. And the trial was far from over. The sun had moved across the sky by the time the court took its short break. People filed out of the courtroom, still buzzing with questions. Jacob stayed seated, quietly flipping through his notes while others stretched their legs or went for coffee. Judge Hollins remained on the bench for a moment longer, watching Jacob closely. There was no longer humor in his eyes. Instead, there was curiosity and maybe a hint of respect. Outside in the hallway, a small group of reporters whispered to each other. "He's not just smart," one of them said. "He's prepared. He knows this case better than anyone. Where did he even come from?" Another asked. "He's a teenager." Back inside, the courtroom slowly filled again. The next witness was someone the prosecution believed would seal the case, the shop's security guard. He claimed to have seen Mr. Langley leaving the store, holding something in his hand. Mr. Collins looked confident as the guard gave his testimony. "So you're sure it was the defendant?" he asked. Absolutely, the guard answered. I saw him leave and walk toward the alley. Jacob listened quietly, tapping his pen against his notebook just once. His face didn't change. The moment came for cross-examination. Jacob stood up again, walking slowly toward the witness. His steps were quiet, but the room felt heavy with silence. Sir, Jacob said, you said you saw the defendant leave the store. Yes. From what distance? About 20 feet. And what time was this? Around 9:10 p.m. Jacob pulled out a paper from his file. This is a copy of your original statement to the police. Can you please read the time you wrote down? The guard took the paper, read it, and frowned. 9:25 p.m. So which is correct? Jacob asked. 9:10 or 9:25? The guard looked nervous. I must have gotten mixed up. Jacob nodded calmly. And the man you saw, what was he wearing? A black hoodie and jeans. Jacob picked up a photo from the evidence table. This is Mr. Langley the night of his arrest. He's wearing a light gray jacket, not a black hoodie. The guard's face turned red. Maybe I got the color wrong. Maybe, Jacob said, then looked at the jury. Or maybe you didn't see him at all. A quiet gasp came from the back of the courtroom. One of the jurors raised an eyebrow, clearly thinking hard about what had just been said. The guard shifted uncomfortably. I don't know, he muttered. Jacob returned to his seat, not saying another word. The judge glanced at the prosecutor, who was now flipping through his notes faster than before. Mr. Collins no longer looked calm. His case was starting to fall apart. The crowd in the courtroom stayed silent, but the feeling in the air had changed. This trial was no longer about a teenager surprising people. Now it was about truth, and Jacob was leading the way. After the shaky testimony of the security guard, the courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. People sat straighter in their seats. The jury watched every move. Even Judge Hollins, who had started the day with doubt in his voice, now seemed fully focused. Jacob had not only defended Mr. Langley, he had slowly pulled the case apart, one witness at a time. But the biggest moment was still to come. Mr. Collins stood to call this final witness. He spoke louder than usual, trying to take control of the room again. The prosecution calls Detective Harper to the stand. A tall, serious-looking man in a plain suit stepped forward. He was the lead detective on the case and had years of experience. Everyone believed this would be the strongest part of the prosecution. Detective Harper spoke with confidence. He explained the timeline, the evidence, and why he believed Mr. Langley was guilty. He talked about fingerprints, camera footage, and past reports. Jacob didn't interrupt. He listened, just like before, his pen moving slowly. When the detective finished, the judge turned to Jacob. Mr. Tanner, he said, your cross-examination. Jacob stood calmly, holding 2 pages in his hand. He walked forward and stopped a few steps from the witness stand. Detective Harper, he began, you said you reviewed the security camera footage from the store, correct? Yes, the detective replied. And you based your report on that video? That's right. Jacob nodded. Then can you explain this? He held up the 2 pages for the court to see. What are those? The detective asked. One is your original report, Jacob said, and the other is a certified transcript of the video that was recovered after the backup files were restored yesterday. A quiet stir ran through the courtroom. The original video you saw was cut short, Jacob continued. It stopped at 9:20 p.m., but the full file continues until 9:45 p.m. and clearly shows Mr. Langley arriving at the store after the event took place. The detective looked surprised. I wasn't aware of any updated footage. Jacob handed the transcript to the judge. Your Honor, this shows that my client arrived 20 minutes after the break-in. He didn't commit the crime. He walked into a situation he had nothing to do with. The judge read the paper slowly. The room was silent except for the sound of pages turning. Finally, Judge Hollins looked up. Mr. Collins, were you aware of this? The prosecutor shook his head. No, Your Honor. This is new to me. Jacob took a step back. Then the accusation against Mr. Langley no longer holds. All of the evidence now points to someone else. People in the courtroom gasped. Even the jury exchanged surprised looks. It was the moment everything changed. And in the middle of it all stood Jacob, calm, clear, and unshaken. The courtroom was completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone was waiting for what would happen next. Jacob stood beside the defense table, hands resting calmly on his file. He had just shown the court the most important piece of evidence, the video transcript that cleared Mr. Langley. The judge looked at the paper one more time, then removed his glasses and placed them gently on the bench. "Mr. Collins," he said firmly, "do you have anything to say regarding this new information?" The prosecutor stood slowly. "Your Honor, based on the new footage, we no longer have enough evidence to continue this case." Jacob didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He just nodded quietly and looked at Mr. Langley, who stared at him with wide eyes. "In that case," Judge Hollins said, "the court finds the defendant not guilty. Mr. Langley, you are free to go." As the judge banged the gavel, the sound echoed through the room. A few people clapped. Others just looked stunned. Mr. Langley stood up slowly, still trying to believe what he had heard. He turned to Jacob. I don't know what to say." Jacob gave him a small nod. "You don't have to say anything." The bailiff opened the side door, and Mr. Langley walked out of the courtroom a free man. Reporters rushed forward, trying to speak to Jacob. People shouted questions, but Jacob simply gathered his papers, placed them in his bag, and started walking toward the exit. "Wait," someone called. It was Judge Hollins. Jacob turned around. "Young man," the judge said, "I have been in this courtroom for over 20 years. I have seen hundreds of lawyers, but I've never seen someone like you." Jacob paused but said nothing. "How old are you, really?" the judge asked. 17, Jacob answered honestly. Gasps filled the room. The judge shook his head slowly, half in shock, half in amazement. "You may not have a degree yet, but you have the mind of someone twice your age. Wherever you're going in life, don't stop." Jacob gave a respectful nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he left the courtroom, people began clapping, not loudly, but with true respect. Even Mr. Collins stood still, watching him leave with a thoughtful look. Outside, the sun was shining. Jacob stepped onto the courthouse steps, where cameras were flashing and people gathered to get a glimpse of the boy who had just changed everything. He didn't stop for pictures. He didn't talk to the press. He simply walked down the steps, head held high, his bag over his shoulder. And just before he disappeared into the crowd, a voice from the back of the crowd shouted, "Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this." Jacob didn't look back, because he wasn't chasing attention. He was chasing truth.